happy to be here at Vermont Law School. It's our honor and pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and for us to have Jill Stein speak to you. I am Elizabeth Parker, and I am the volunteer coordinator for Vermont, so I hope that all of you signed up to get a yard sign. That's part of our strategy, is yard signs, and also to volunteer. If you haven't already signed up on jill2016.com, please do go to jillvt.com, which is our state website. I have the honor of introducing two Vermont law school students, Aisatu and Yannick, and they're going to speak with you briefly before Jill comes on. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
My name is Aisatu Diallo. I'm a second year student here at Vermont Law School.
Hello, my name is Yannick Murray. I am a 3L here at Vermont Law School.
We just want to say thank you again for coming out to such a fascinating event. So the lack of environmental protection is becoming one of the biggest injustices we are facing. The connection between the environment and basic human rights has gained international recognition, both in a positive way and in a negative way. Today's speaker has been on the front line to help combat environmental injustices. She played a key role in the effort to get the Massachusetts fish advisories updated to better protect women and children from mercury contamination. She also helped lead a successful campaign to clean up the filthy 5 coal plants in Massachusetts. That was an effort that resulted in getting the coal plant regulation signed into law. Her testimony on the effects of mercury and dioxide contamination from the burning of waste helped preserve the Massachusetts moratorium on new trash incinerators constructions in the state of Massachusetts. She has also received several awards for health and environmental protection, including the Clean Waters Act Action, Not in Anyone's Backyard Award, the Children's Health Hero Award, and Toxic Action Center Citizen Award. Her efforts to add the pressure on environmental injustices continue and include fighting for a healthy environment to be considered as a human right, assisting nonprofits, community groups, and Native Americans, combating environmental injustices and racism and dangerous exposures like lead and mercury in the air and water. She's also helping with dangerous toxic sites and has taken a keen interest using her voice and experience to reopen a discourse about the gas pipeline that can negatively affect us here in Vermont.
So my angle is a little bit different here. I kind of want to, sort of give a little bit of a lesson. I think this will be a good refresher for some people, and for some people it'll be new knowledge, as I actually was just kind of educated on some of this yesterday and a bit today. So since the early 19th century, major party candidates have dominated the Electoral College. Early in the life of our nation, we confronted technical difficulties with presidential elections. But the Electoral College is not the final arbiter, unless we the people make it so. I won't digress into a full history of this political mechanism, but it starts with the election of 1800. That was the one involving Adams and Jefferson. But for us it starts with the 12th Amendment. This amendment supersedes Article 2, Section 1, Subpart 2, which was like the original formula for the Electoral College. In gist, the Amendment 12 states that if no candidate receives the majority of the Electoral College's votes, the House of Representatives shall choose the president from one of the top 3 candidates immediately by ballot. That said, we have with us today one of the top 4 prospects who could lead our country for the next 4 years. Without further ado, we would like to introduce to you Green Party nominee Jill Stein, Dr. Jill Stein.
Thank you, guys. Thanks so much. It's just wonderful that you were able to inform us about how the electoral process works. Jill is just finishing up an interview, and she's going to be out as soon as is humanly possible. So So I'm going to just ask how many people have gone to jill2016.com and signed up to volunteer. Let's raise our hands. Ooh. Okay, I encourage you to do so. There are all sorts of volunteer positions, from the simplest thing of putting a yard sign in your yard to the more advanced things like becoming the state coordinator and completely changing your life for 8 weeks. So I encourage you to do so. And then just a little bit of how many people are from the southern part of the state. I know that there were some West Dummerston people. I see some hands. Okay, how many people are from South Royalton or Bethel? Bethel. Awesome. And Burlington? Yeah, I knew there were some Burlington people. Awesome. Do you all know each other? You got to kind of network here. Good. And Montpelier? I see you, Montpelier people. I saw you come in. Awesome. And what about the Northeast Kingdom? Do we have anyone from the Northeast Kingdom? Hey, bravo! Okay. Awesome, awesome. Rutland? Woohoo! Awesome. Thank you. All righty. Okay. Without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Jill Stein, our next president.
Thank you all so much. Big thank you to Betsy Parker and Betsy Gerald, if I have the names right. Yes, thank you all so much. Also, a thank you to Scott Spinucci, if I have the name right also, who I guess was instrumental in kind of agitating to make this happen. And a big thank you to all of you for all the agitating that you do in order to ensure that we will have a world to survive in going forward. So it's really a great honor to be here. So I just want to give you a big thank you, and give yourselves a round of applause. And I'm told that we're going to do this mostly as Q&A, which would be wonderful. I think always more meaningful and empowering. I'll just, make a brief kind of overview. I've just come from the Standing Rock Sioux fight. And I did not plan to engage in civil disobedience when I went there, because I have learned, as I think many of you have, that it's not a convenient and easy thing to do. And thank goodness that there are good attorneys out there that make this possible. Otherwise, we would really be taking our lives in our hands. I was there really to support the leadership of our indigenous nations, their incredible courage and heroism in standing up for their rights, which are really human rights that are essential for us all. And as we know, their human rights are under attack, not only in the challenges that have been put to them, the road blockades, the difficulty getting food through and communications and all kinds of things like that, but also the desecration of their ancestral lands and the mowing down of their burial sites the very day after they had just filed with the authorities where those sites were so that they could be protected. Suddenly those sites were targeted, and it was hard to not connect the dots between the public information about those sites and then their attack in the dark of night on a weekend when they had supposedly ceased activity pending another court decision. So it was an incredible assault on human rights. There's also an assault going on water, not only the water that feeds and nourishes the reservation, but 17 million people downstream at a time of incredible water scarcity, when our water is not only under assault by climate warming, but also by the fracking industry and the fossil fuel industry that is polluting our water supplies and draining them, particularly around fracking. It felt like they are putting their lives on the line for us all, for our water. And then, of course, with the climate emergency being what it is, with the fires up and down the West Coast right now, 100,000 people having been displaced just in this recent fire emergency. and about 100,000 people whose homes were either destroyed or damaged in Louisiana, then the heat waves and the drought, and the most recent science from both Jim Hansen and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that spoke at a recent insurance conference, a national conference of insurance agencies, where the senior scientist described what she called an oh my God study. Have people heard about the oh my God study? That basically says it's similar to Hansen's study, except the time frame is even closer. Hansen's time frame was by 2060, as soon as 2060 that we could see tens of feet of sea level rise, and this latest study apparently says as soon as 2050 that we could see as much as 9 feet of sea level rise, which, as you know, is not a temporary thing. It's just the first installment of basically hundreds of feet of sea level rise. And with every improvement in the studies, the day of reckoning is getting closer and closer. So I am just, so grateful to you and the mission, or one of the missions of this law school, and your expertise in environmental law, but also very grateful to our indigenous leaders because they are putting their lives on the line for us all. So when I was asked to lock down with them, I felt like I wasn't prepared to lock down without, having given that some thought in advance, and I said no. And then they came back and they said, well, would you join us in writing a message on this piece of construction equipment that was just used to mow down our burial sites? And how could any human being say no to that? And what I said was to bring all the support that a presidential campaign can muster. I adopted their message by saying, I approve this message. And that's what I inscribed. So that in a nutshell, I think kind of says where I'm coming from. I am, by training, I'm a medical doctor, and I say I'm in this race because I'm a mother on fire, which I think all of us are, whether we're mothers, fathers, sons, or daughters. We're on fire. If our eyes are open, we need to be on fire. If we are going to save the planet, if we are going to save our economy, if we're going to save democracy, if we're going to save human rights. There's a famous quote from Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court Justice, that we have a choice between democracy or vast concentrations of wealth. Well, that wealth has been really concentrating here, for many decades, basically since the last crash in the 1930s, followed by some protections that have been unraveling ever since. And now we have really come to a real tipping point, and we have to decide which way we are going to tip. Are we going to take back this promise of democracy and create an economy that works for all of us, create an energy policy that zeroes out fossil fuels by 2030? We call for an emergency phase out of our fossil fuels. 100% clean renewable energy by 2030. That's what the science tells us we have to do. We have to stop these endless expanding wars, these wars on terror that in fact have created more terror while they bankrupt our budget and make us in the words of the rest of the world and in polls, we are now perceived as the greatest threat to world peace. So we call for an end to this catastrophic foreign policy, which is also catastrophic to the climate. And what are they fighting about anyhow? Fossil fuels and their routes of transportation. So how about instead of investing in the lethal destruction of our future, instead we demilitarize our foreign policy and render the whole fossil fuel conflict moot and obsolete. And we put those dollars into true security, not just us, but the Russians and the Chinese, who are having lots of problems of their own with their economies. They cannot afford their military budgets, which are a very small fraction of ours, a tiny fraction. And you know, if we were all investing in our own emergency energy transitions, fighting against our common enemy, our greatest common enemy ever known to humanity, that is climate change, catastrophic climate change, you know, what a different future we would have. So, you know, we're here, our campaign is here, I'm a mother on fire, and, you know, I think there are so many other mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers on fire out there that we actually do have the power to take our democracy back and to do that in real time. And let me just say, to get in one last issue, and then I'll open the floor, but there are 43 million young people and not so young people who are trapped in predatory student loan debt with no way out except through our campaign, which will bail out the students like we bailed out the crooks on Wall Street. It's about time to bail out the victims of Wall Street. It's a tiny fraction of the cost, and it is the stimulus package of our dreams. We know that for every dollar we put into higher education, we get back $7 in return, and those are hard facts from the GI Bill following the Second World War. So this pays for itself many times over. We can come up with the 1.5 trillion, a small fraction of the 16 trillion that we came up with for the guys peddling the waste, fraud, and abuse on Wall Street. So we can do this, and this is not something you need to keep a secret, and that is that there are enough people locked into that debt. That alone is a winning plurality of the presidential race in a three-way vote. So if we actually got the word out to the people for whom this is, in my experience, an irresistible reason to come out and vote green in 2016 and to tell all your friends, because friends don't let friends stay home in debt, in 2016, we could actually bring out enough people to take over this election and to win it, not only to cancel student debt, to make public higher education free, to create health care as a human right through Medicare for all, to launch a Green New Deal, to create a welcoming path to citizenship, to put an end to police violence and the racist war on drugs, and a foreign policy based on international law and human rights, not on economic and military domination. So in short, we can have an America and a world that works for all of us, that puts people, planet, and peace over profit, and the power to create that world is not just relegated to our hopes and our dreams. That power is actually right here, right now, at the Vermont School of Law and beyond. That power is in our hands. Thank you very much.
Okay, now for question and answer. Betsy, you want to raise your hand?
Yes,
Betsy's
I'm right
by
here.
a
If you have a
microphone.
question, you can line up and use the microphone, please.
And I've probably given more press conferences in the last 2 weeks than Hillary Clinton has in her career, I think. So I'm not afraid of questions. Bring them on.
Dr. Stein, if you remember, we first met in New Hampshire, a documentary producer producing a documentary called Nexus of Power, and it has to do with big money and media's influence over U.S. presidential elections. My question for you is, seemingly the media, I think seems to be cooperative, okay? Maybe they're placating you. Do you expect some sort of blowback in terms of maybe an Aleppo moment that Gary Johnson felt? And if you have any comments on traditional media and their coverage of you.
Great. So first thing about Gary Johnson's Aleppo moment, I think his Aleppo moment is actually small change compared to Donald Trump's moments, hours, days worth of hate and fear. I would say the same thing for Hillary Clinton's, career of influence peddling and doling out favors to the economic and political elite. So as far as I'm concerned, Gary Johnson is not the one to worry about here, whose qualifications for office, or who I should say, whose disqualifications for office are far smaller than the other candidates. And about media, my only comment there is, we have the First Amendment for a very important reason. We protect the rights of the press and of free speech because democracy relies on a free press so that we can have an informed, educated, and empowered electorate. So when the press says to me, well, how are you ever going to get the word out about your campaign? You're running so low in the polls. I say, well, isn't that your job? Isn't that what the press is supposed to be doing? Donald Trump has had 4 billion and counting of free media. Hillary's had 2 billion. We've had essentially zip, yet we are still far higher in the polls than any non-corporate campaign has been. Yes, Gary Johnson's doing better, but he is a corporate campaign. Remember who founded the Libertarians? One of the Koch brothers was among the founders of the Libertarians. So they accept money. They do not support campaign finance reform. In their view, you just need to wear a logo of your corporate sponsor, and that the corporations can go ahead and buy whatever airtime or policies they want, which in my view, we're not going to fix anything until we get the money out and put the people back in to our politics. And that includes reclaiming our airwaves so that the public airwaves are actually available for free to qualified candidates for their public education, information, advertising, etc., and for debates, which should include all candidates who are actually on the ballot in enough states to win. So let you ask.
That was kind of my question. Hi, I'm Nicole, and I'm curious. Are you trying to get into the debates? Are you doing anything on your end to be involved in them?
Yes, and we have been. We had 2 court cases along with the Libertarian Party, making the point that Americans not only have a right to vote, we have a right to know who we can vote for. So we have a right to open debates. The League of Women Voters quit the debates in the 1980s when the Democratic and Republican parties took over the commission. So the commission, they called a fraud being perpetrated on the American voter. We need to open up those debates, and we need to get the commission out of the way of actually having meaningful debates, because what they are right now is like some new form of water torture, Chinese water torture, of having to listen to this just insanity. People don't tune in, and the debates
You deserve to be there too. You're a presidential candidate. You deserve to be there.
And exactly, and both Gary and I are on the ballot for what's going to be like at least 95% of voters. In our case, I think we're on the ballot for 48 states. In an election where the majority of voters have rejected the 2 major party candidates who have the highest rates of disapproval and distrust ever in history, over 75% of voters are now saying they want to open up the debates. So what is this private commission whose purpose actually is to silence political opposition? That is not democracy. That is 2-party tyranny, and it's time to put it to an end. One last comment on this, which is that one way or the other, I am going to show up at the debates. Last time, my running mate Sherry Honkala and I showed up and attempted to walk into the debates, and we were arrested. This time, we hope to show up with many people in company. So I urge you to go to our website, sign up to be a part of the campaign, and consider coming with us to actually take a stand. At Standing Rock, we are standing up for democracy and the future of the planet. We need to stand up for democracy and the future of our planet in our debates. If I'm not in the debate, there will be no discussion of the climate crisis as it really stands, because they both, support either fracking or coal. And you know what? That's not much difference when it comes down to it. They may have different ideologies, different wrappers, but same thing. There will not be an alternative on this catastrophic series of wars that we are engaged in, and there will be no discussion of nuclear weapons. We have 2,000 of them on hair trigger alert right now. Hillary Clinton, it's hard to say which one is the greater war hawk here, but we don't know what Trump intends to do, and that's pretty scary. And Hillary's record is actually pretty scary, and her intended policy in Syria is also pretty scary because she wants to start an air war with another nuclear-armed power, Russia, when we have 2,000 nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert. And recent U.S. policy has been, as they say, baiting the bear. And we are not, the Cold War is about as hot as it's ever been right now, and this is a very dangerous moment. That policy needs to be seen in the light of day and needs to be debated. That won't happen unless I'm in the debate, and I won't be in the debate unless we are all standing up for democracy. So I encourage everyone to, get in a bus or a carpool or whatever, and come to Hofstra University on September 26th. And let's open the barred gates to our future of our democracy.
Okay, hi, I'm Ariana. I'm gonna probably mess up my question because I'm a little bit starstruck because I adore you, but
It's mutual.
my question revolves around, I'm sure you know, there was a massive dairy industry bailout recently, and I was wondering what threat you see the animal agriculture industry to the environment and to economics, and also in that same vein, the subsidies that we provide to corn and such. What kind of economic threat and environmental threats you see those as?
So it's huge, and thank you for bringing it up. Our Green New Deal, I should emphasize, it not only looks at energy and transportation, it's also about food system transformation. It's about ending this corporate takeover of our food system, and it's about putting those subsidies back where they should be, into family farms, into community farms, into worker cooperatives, into CSAs, into a healthy and sustainable food system. Because we need it if we're going to zero out fossil fuels, because the food system is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, the methane from the CAFOs, as well as the carbon inputs to running agribusiness farming. The impacts to the climate, to our economy, and also to our health. This is another major reason why it's really important to transition to, as quickly as possible, to a healthy, relocalized, sustainable, and organic food system. So it's absolutely front and center. It's bad for workers, that is both CAFOs and in particular, the pesticide dependent industrial agriculture. It's bad for our communities all up and down, from workers, farm workers, to communities who get the blow off, and to the consumption of this food. The stuff that we're eating, is generally, it's got the good stuff taken out, it's got the nutrients out, and it's got bad stuff put in. And the public health epidemics that we are fighting right now have everything to do not only with fossil fuel pollution, 200,000 unnecessary premature deaths every year from fossil fuels. And remember, those deaths are just the tip of the iceberg of this epidemic of illnesses: asthma, heart attacks, strokes, cancers, etc. It has a huge impact, and we can reverse that rather quickly. Last point I'll make here is that the country of Cuba, had to change their energy system and their food system very quickly overnight. They did not have a planned transition, so it was a stressful transition. When the Soviet Union fell apart and Cuba's oil pipeline went down, overnight they had to create an organic and healthy food system and go green on their transportation too. And what happened overnight, Their death rate from diabetes went down 50%, their obesity rates went down 50%, their deaths from heart attacks and strokes went down about 30%, and all-cause mortality went down about 20%. So, in other words, it was a time of incredible stress. You'd think they would be sicker, but actually everybody got healthier just from moving to a green economy in which a healthy food system is a key component. So, let's do it.
Good afternoon, Dr. Stein. I went through your live streams and got questions from all around the country. So I have one man, his name's Patch Davis in Florida, and he'd like to know what you feel about big sugar, the toxic algae that's being dealt with down there, and that it is a key state, and that Florida, they all want you to come down, so we look forward to seeing you on the 30th. But basically, he wants to know, and you touched on a little bit with Monsanto, I think you were alluding to that.
Great.
So, and the next part, the other key state, the heartland, the rural farmers, and they'd like to see you come out there as well, Dr. Stein.
Great, wonderful, thank you. So actually, I've just come from Iowa, and Iowa and another rural state, which I'm working on at the moment. We've been to like, which one? Nebraska, yes, thank you. Iowa and Nebraska, and it was amazing to see the political revolution alive and well in our rural states, and the hunger, for democracy, for a progressive campaign, and for a healthy food system. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to say a few more things about Monsanto, because one of the major threats of this corporate agriculture are the GMOs. And the studies have not been done to actually understand what the human health impacts are. As someone who has studied environmental health, I've learned that you really don't know what you don't know until you actually test this for long periods of time. Unfortunately, we have a regulatory system that protects profits and not people. So we allow people to be exposed, like to lead, for example, for almost a century before we began to really get the lead out of gasoline and out of paint. Meantime, we had sort of spread it everywhere, almost permanently in our environment, in our soil, in our buildings, etc. So we need a very different form of regulation that actually, a precautionary form of regulation that uses common sense to protect people and not profits. We have exposures going on now, but we wouldn't know if there are impacts, if there are long-term and chronic impacts. And in my understanding, there are no good long-term studies, not even in animals. The studies that are done are short-term. So we don't know what we're doing in terms of human health impacts. However, we know about pesticide impacts, and that when species are made genetically engineered, almost entirely that means they are made pesticide tolerant, so that we can use far greater levels of pesticide and put our farm workers at greater risk and pollute our water supplies and our farming communities and all that. Yet, the food systems are not more sustainable, they're not more secure, they require intensive inputs, of all resources. So it's not clear what purpose is being served here, except for the profits of Monsanto, etc. Meanwhile, we do know what the environmental risks are, and that is when you eliminate biodiversity and an entire, diverse species of corn, for example, or even cotton, but in particular corn, because it's a food, when all we have left are 3 or 4 varieties where we used to have thousands, that's very dangerous. Nature loves diversity and has created diversity for good reason. It's an insurance policy against changes that are unpredictable. So the takeover of our food supply and of our seeds by corporate organizations is inherently extremely dangerous. So for that reason alone, we should not be permitting genetically modified agriculture, in my view. And we need to join, dozens, scores of other nations around the world that have prohibited GMO agriculture.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm a college student up here at UVM. I'm originally from Washington, D.C. I'd like to know if you have a plan for giving Washington, D.C. representation in either the Senate or the House of Representatives.
Great, wonderful, thank you. Yes, indeed, we do, and the Green Party in Washington, D.C. is actually a fusion of the Green Party and the D.C. Statehood Party, which has been advocating for D.C. statehood. Why should the capital of our so-called democracy essentially be a colony who does not have full rights of self-rule or representation? So absolutely, DC needs representation, and it needs its own, autonomy over its own budget, which it does not have. How we do that, I think, is by standing up for it. I think it is an offense against our basic sense of democracy that our own capital does not have self-rule. We need to put that era of colonialism behind us. Thank you.
Hi, Joe.
Hi.
Don't mind me, I'm a little bit nervous. But I guess I hope I framed my question correctly. So my question is concerning media in the US, and I think this election cycle, more than any other event in history, has really shown the power that media has over information that the American people intake as a product. And if you trace all the media companies back, over 90% of all media in America is owned by 3 major corporations. That sounds like a monopoly to me.
Exactly.
So I guess my question is, with all the rhetoric and fallacy and intentional misinformation that's spread around and that's seeped into everyday facets of our life, including education, what can we do to rise above all the misinformation and all this spread of falsehood and hold media accountable to a more professional level of journalism and to keep them out of our education?
Great, thank you so much. Really important question. And I think you sort of hinted at what needs to be the key answer here, which is that we need to use antitrust laws and break up the media conglomerates, which have been so destructive to the cause of journalism and the press. So that's where we start, is we break them up so that we have, again, lots of smaller independent media organizations. The president, I believe, of CBS, or maybe he's the CEO of CBS, I guess. I don't know that they have presidents. Recently said that Donald Trump may be terrible for America, and I'm paraphrasing him, but he sure is great for our bottom line. Yes. And that in a nutshell is what's going on right now. You have the media kind of pumping up, these really crazed campaigns, and these really, people who should never be among the contenders for the highest office of the land. Why are they there? Or why is he there? Donald Trump is there because he's a showman, and he's really pumped up viewership so that people can basically gawk and, sort of engage in retribution. So many of the Trump supporters I know, they're just so angry for good reason at this awful system. And so you have a demagogue who steps in and who's lifted up by the media and really brings out our worst qualities as human beings. So agree completely, we need to break up the media. We also need to take back the airwaves. And in my view, ultimately, we need to get money out of politics, which is not so hard to do. We need public financing of campaigns. The complaint about that is, oh, that's way too expensive, Billion-dollar campaigns would have to be subsidized by the taxpayers. Well, actually, the cost of those campaigns is the media. So if we just take back the public airwaves for public use, guess what? It's really cheap to publicly fund political campaigns, as they should be.
Yeah, I was, in order to completely phase out fossil fuels, you'll need full cooperation from federal government, state governments, municipalities, and the private sector. So how would your administration be able to ensure that cooperation would occur, and how would it be able to get us onto the step to phase out fossil fuels?
Really, that's the most important question here, really. So, for one thing, we move the subsidies. And how do we move the subsidies? I think my campaign doesn't get elected unless we have a real groundswell of disenfranchised and disempowered voters who decide they're not going to take it anymore. But if that groundswell were to happen and I was to be elected, we would also be bringing scores of Greens into Congress and progressive Democrats. So it would be a very different playing field. We would also have an enormous public mandate. But most importantly, because we are talking about canceling student debt, in my view, this is what engages the most powerful engine for the rest of our agenda. If we are liberating young people from student debt, then suddenly we have the ground troops to actually weigh in and enable our democracy to be the driver of our agenda. So number one on that agenda, after bailing out students, number two then is the Green New Deal. Shifting our subsidies, so we're presuming that we have the power to push this through Congress, to shift those subsidies, which are somewhere around $40 billion a year right now for fossil fuels. But we're also talking about cutting back on the military. In fact, cutting the military in half, because this bloated, dangerous military is not making us safer. And when we're not having to fight for fossil fuels, we don't need 800 bases in 100 countries around the world either. So we have lots of money to actually put into this to create the proper subsidies. The Green New Deal actually calls for $500 million of a stimulus package, creating those jobs to bring on this new energy system. But the question is still there. What do we do about the existing fossil fuel infrastructure? And one of the ideas that we are exploring right now is empowering the EPA to fully protect public health and the environment. Because if in fact the science is telling us that our days are numbered, that is the hugest impact on human health that is imaginable. Extinction is not an acceptable impact on human health. So, so if the EPA is truly going to step up to the plate, then we actually have to not only have a so-called clean power transition and phase out coal, we actually need to have the authority to phase out fossil fuels altogether. So, there are carrots and there are sticks, but one way or the other, I think it's going on the record about what we're actually facing here that is the missing link. The public really needs to understand the terms of what this crisis is and the potential catastrophe that is only decades down the line. If that is understood, I think there's no doubt that we will mobilize, particularly when people understand they don't have to give up a job in order to fix the climate. In fact, they will get a job in order to fix the climate.
So with some places like Flint, which have horrible water quality, in particular, just the pipeline, especially Dakota Access Pipeline as well, what I notice is that once the media has sort of had its fun with it, they move on. Flint still has the same problems. Only 33 houses have had their pipes fixed, and nobody even knows which houses those are. So how do you keep pressure on these places to make sure that the problems are solved instead of us moving on once we're sick of it?
Exactly, very good point. And I think it underscores why we need a real system solution here. We can't just react to one community's emergency after the other. Detroit has its own set of water crisis issues right now, where they are shutting down. They're turning off the water supplies in poor homes who are facing eviction, because they can't both pay their rent and pay their water bills, which have skyrocketed, like they've doubled and tripled. It's just astounding. So, this is why, we say that we're not going to solve this with window dressing around the margins. This is why we call for an emergency Green New Deal with federal subsidies that will be applied locally as the communities decide that they need them. What do they need to do in order to become sustainable? And the Green New Deal provides these parameters that include greening our energy our food, our transportation, restoring our ecosystems is also part of this, and other critical infrastructure that communities need in order to be sustainable ecologically as well as economically and socially. So this all would come under the purview of the Green New Deal, providing the subsidies and the jobs to actually remake these water systems. We cannot do this while we are spending half of our discretionary budget destroying schools and hospitals and infrastructure around the world. This is why justice at home is inseparable from justice abroad. We need them both if we're to fix the climate crisis as well as the human rights crisis and the health crisis. But fortunately, the solutions come together here. In the same way that the crises compound each other, the solutions also compound each other. And as we move to a Green New Deal, in fact, one of the things I should have mentioned, another way that this pays for itself is that we get so much healthier that the savings in our healthcare system are enough to actually pay the costs of the transition. So we free up more resources. The more healthy we become and the more sustainable we become, the more capable we are of continuing this upward transition.
Good afternoon, Dr. Stein. My name is Will Goodwin. I'm a nurse practitioner from Danby, Vermont. My understanding is that if all of Bernie's supporters and half of the independents and all of the Green Party people got together and voted for you, that you would win in a landslide. And my question is, what do you say to voters who are afraid that, you know, they want to vote for you, they like what you stand for, but they're afraid that if they vote for you, Trump will win?
Great. All right, really important question. Thank you. So there are many reasons, and the reasons that I give sort of depend on who I'm talking to, because different reasons will work with different people, and I encourage you to just have sort of that toolkit and just draw out what works. So one reason that I think is really important and compelling is to encourage people to look at the track record of voting your fears, because that's what we've been doing, voting against the guy we hate the most instead of for what we really believe. But that strategy has a track record. All the reasons we were told to vote for the lesser evil, we didn't want the expanding wars, we didn't want the meltdown of the climate, and in fact the Democrats have been every bit as bad, even when Obama had 2 houses of Congress. All of the above is arguably worse for the climate than drill baby drill was under George Bush. Yes, we created renewable energy, and that was great, but nature doesn't care about renewable energy. Nature cares about greenhouse gases. And we took the lid off of greenhouse gas production. So the rate of climate emission increase has actually massively increased over the last 8 years. The attack on immigrant rights, the massive bailouts for Wall Street, you know, we got this politics of fear delivered everything we were afraid of. So it actually doesn't do the trick. As a practical matter, it also doesn't do the trick. The lesser evil basically paves the way to the greater evil. That's why after the election of a lesser evil president, both houses of Congress were lost, because people could not bring themselves to come out and vote for lesser evil politicians, and they were all over the, you know, the midterm elections. Lesser evil politicians who are throwing you under the bus do not bring out the votes. So Congress flipped from blue to red, one house and then the other, not because the Republicans were winning races, but because the Democratic base just could not bring themselves out to come and vote. And if you look at where Donald Trump comes from, this is a whole right-wing extremism that has risen up. It's not just him alone, you know, there are lots of people like him, and in Europe as well. Where is this right-wing extremism coming from? It's coming from the globalization, from the financialization, from throwing workers under the bus, from austerity budgets, upheld by both Democrats and Republicans. And in fact, in this country, it was Wall Street deregulation, thank you, Bill Clinton, and it was NAFTA, thank you, Bill Clinton, that in short, you know, if you want to have a little soundbite, there may be differences between the two parties, but they're not different enough to save your job, to save your life, or to save the planet. If we are going to get out of here alive, we need to stand up and put our feet down and stand our ground and start moving forward. Because you notice what happens from one election to the next. It's always the worst imaginable Republican out there. So let's be clear, it's not getting better. Both parties are marching to the right, and our survival is imperiled. But we live in a democracy, we have more than two choices, and as you imply, if we just stand up with the courage of our convictions, guess what? We have not only the solutions, we have all the numbers we need to actually win the day.
My name is Bill Rice from Randolph Center. I'm an engineer, and you said, I think you said, bring it on, and I'd like to go to the third rail. And I assume you've watched the collapse of, actually at 206, of course, 901, we all were sick on that day, but in 2006, I watched a lecture on video by Stephen Jones of Brigham Young University, and for the first time I'd ever seen it was the collapse of the 47-story Solomon Brothers Building 7, and it went straight down in 6.5 seconds, in between other high-rise buildings in a perfect controlled demolition. And I encourage everyone here that thinks the official stories of 9/11 are true to just go to that one thing. It happened at 5:20 in the afternoon after the pyroclastic clouds from the towers being blown up. You could see this one, and it's perfect. It is a conventional from the bottom, not from the top down, but from the bottom where you do your normal. So my question is this, I guess. I better get to it, right? Are you going to punch me? I will. My question is this, and this is out of your letter. We would create an independent 9/11 commission, not one dominated by members with an interest in protecting the reputation and careers of foreign affairs and the intelligence communities.
Yes, so on the same day that we had put out that press release, it turned out former Senator Robert Graham, who was one of the chairs of the commission, put out an op-ed in the New York Times calling for an ongoing investigation, that the investigation need to be reopened, that there are thousands upon thousands of pages of new information that was not available to the commission, that the commission seemed to be set up for failure, and that the 28 redacted pages only released recently themselves gave many leads that need to be followed up on with the Saudis in particular. So, you know, we need to do right by, you know, the victims of 9/11 and everything that has followed. We need to understand what happened and why it happened. And there was Colleen, whose last name, one of the FBI agents who was railing at the FBI about the leads that they had discovered in advance that were ignored. She too has put out an article, I think, in Counterpunch. Colleen Rowley is her name, and she was a career FBI agent, and she had very suspicious information about the pilots that were in training, that she was unable to get to FBI headquarters. So yeah, we really need to understand what happened, and I think at the same time we also really need to understand the consequences of the policies that were adopted, because they have been continued long after 9/11, and this is what both Democrats and Republicans are all about now. You won't find anyone right now who's standing up to this policy of catastrophic regime change and this war on terror that needs to be brought to an end. We need a foreign policy based on international law and human rights. And to do justice to the 9/11 victims, we not only need to understand what happened before, but where we're going forward. Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Stein. My name is Matt. I'm a Vermont Law School student. Thank you for being here today. You mentioned earlier what disqualifies some of the other candidates from office. These candidates have held titles including governor, secretary of state, and senator. I think your only governing experience is a member of the Lexington Town Meeting Board. What qualifies you to be president? Thank you.
Great. So let me say, I don't believe any of the candidates should be disqualified from running. I think these are judgments that voters have to make, and that's my own judgment there, that in the scheme of things, I consider what Gary Johnson said small change compared to what in my mind is disqualifying. And in my own mind, what is most disqualifying is being on the payroll of major corporations, of predatory banks, fossil fuel giants, war profiteers, and having a demonstrated record of delivering for them and not on behalf of people. So what I do not bring to office is experience making backroom deals, experience taking money from The United States of America was not founded on the idea that we need experts to rule over us. We are founded on the idea of democracy, and that everyday people who make life and death decisions on our juries, that we are the ones that democracy consists of. And the experience that I have had is actually working with citizen groups, with engaged movements to change our laws and regulations. We actually got money out of politics in Massachusetts through the Clean Elections Law. Unfortunately, the Democrats in the legislature repealed it after we, the people, had passed it. So that's the kind of experience I bring to office. Also the experience working with communities and public health groups to shut down polluting incinerators, to advocate for recycling jobs, to clean up our coal plants, and to protect our health, working for Medicare for all. We came very close to passing that as a referendum if it wasn't for the power of big money to have tilted that election. So I think what I bring to office are the things that the American people are actually clamoring for, and what I do not bring to office are the things that the American people have rejected. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Christopher Gagnon. I'm a student at UVM, and I'm originally from Providence, Rhode Island. So one of the most common criticisms I've heard of the Green Party's 2016 campaign, your campaign, is that it's responding or adjusting too slowly to a changing political atmosphere where more Americans than ever are feeling disenchanted with the broken two-party system. So my question is, with more moderate votes up for grabs, I guess, and people who are not as far left as the Green Party's usual base, is there a long-term strategy, not just in 2016, but in 2016 and going forward, to appeal to these people who want to support the Green Party, but may feel like outsiders among radicals?
So, I guess your question is what's radical, and radical to who? Because, if you actually look at polls, most Americans support reducing the military budget when we are not being goaded by fear campaigns. Most Americans support healthcare as a human right for everyone. Most Americans actually support the right to a job, believe it or not, and polls show that Americans support even the right to a government job if the private sector doesn't step in. And on the right to citizenship, there are polls in which most Americans actually support a welcoming path to citizenship. And I think, we deserve leadership that is willing to stand up for a generation of young people who've been locked into debt. I think there's a very powerful case to be made that we should be bailing out young people and that we should be breaking up the big banks on Wall Street. So, most of the issues where we've taken a stand, I think we can show that the public is actually on our side. And I'll just mention one situation where we fought our way into a debate. I was running for governor in Massachusetts in 2002 against Mitt Romney. And I had the opportunity to speak on behalf of this agenda. At the time, we were also advocating for equal marriage. At the time that before even Massachusetts had adopted it, and the Democrats were wondering even if they would stand for civil unions. So yes, we've been ahead of the curve on some of these things, including on green energy, demilitarizing our budget, ensuring that we have strong public education, not supporting the charterization of our schools, although that wasn't quite the issue back then. 2002, it was more about bilingual education. That was sort of the hot issue. Anyhow, we've taken these very principled stands. I'd say they're radical if they're being critiqued by the political elite. They're considered radical. But in terms of the needs of most Americans, 1 out of every 2 Americans is now in poverty or low income and heading for poverty. Average workers' wages, in fact, are just barely above the poverty level. So I think in terms of political engagement, it's by putting out a really affirmative agenda that we bring people back in to the voting system who just don't have a reason to support it right now. And in this debate where we fought our way in, and I articulated this agenda in a TV studio that only had candidates and a moderator. And our ideas went over like a lead balloon in the rarefied atmosphere of conventional politics. But when I walked out of that debate to where the press was waiting, I was mobbed by the press who told me that I had won the debate on the instant online viewer poll. Which spoke volumes to me about where the public really stands. So, you know, the bottom line here is reject that propaganda. We are the ones we've been waiting for. In Alice Walker's words, the biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. We have it, it's time to use it.
Sadly, we are drawing to the end of our hour, and in an effort to be fair to the last 3 questioners, we're going to have them come up and introduce themselves and ask their question one after another, and then Jill's going to wrap it all together. And then we're not going to have time for individual selfies, we're just going to do a big group picture, and so I'll let you know when that's going to happen. Okay.
And I'll try to do like sort of a lightning response here, so maybe we'll have time for a few selfies. If everybody has their camera ready, and like we'll do it like a production line, and I'll just walk down the line. Get a lot of selfies, maybe? All right, so I'm going to be very disciplined on this one. Okay.
My name is Valdir Cabral, I'm a student here. So from what we see, one of the next job of the next president is to elect the next Supreme Court justice.
Yes.
What direction would you like the court to go into? What are the values and principles that you see in that person?
Great. I can do I'll do just lightning responses. So we need to protect women's rights to choose, our reproductive freedoms. We need to ensure that we're protecting our right to vote, our civil liberties, immigrant rights, and ensure that we have people who are not held hostage by their allegiances to politics as usual and to the economic players who are kind of leading the way in the major political parties right now. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Stein. Thank you so much for coming here. My name is Elizabeth. I'm a 3L, and I'm originally from Baltimore. I was wondering if you had any advice to the young women, both here at the law school and across the country, who want to get involved in the political process in a really meaningful way. And I was wondering if you had any plans on making sure that equally qualified women were considered just as much as the men in the federal agency. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So the question was ensuring that women are appointed?
Ensuring that equally qualified women.
Equally qualified women, yes, absolutely. And we're committed to that. In the Green Party, our leadership is required to be, 50-50. So we're very much committed to women's representation. And likewise, we're committed to having political bodies that look like our communities. So at all levels of government. Thank you very much.
My name is Liz Blum. I'm from Norwich, Vermont. I'm the county chair, this county, of the Vermont Progressive Party. And nobody's mentioned one of the big elephants in the room, Palestine and Israel. So I'd like you to answer what your policy is on that.
Thank you very much. Really critical issue. Our general policy Our general foreign policy is that it needs to be based not on economic and military domination, but on human rights, international law, and diplomacy. And we would put our allies on notice and put our own government on notice that we are changing course and that we will no longer be supplying funding and weapons to countries that stand in flagrant violation of international law and human rights. So this means Saudis, you don't get your weapons anymore, and it means Israeli army, you don't get your $8 million a day.